So Alliance Solutions Group is America's largest construction technology leader. Our vision is to be the premier provider of technology solutions for the construction and real estate industry and become a partner for life with our clients. We have 60 plus employees and over 4,000 clients nationwide. That is not users, that is clients. We have offices in California, Texas, and Florida. What that means to you if you decide to partner with us is that we are local. We have people all over the country ready to help and assist in your implementation and get you live and happy with the products. Reasons to partner with us: construction expertise. The team has over 500 years of experience. For instance, I've been doing this about 30 years. We have certified consultants, so they go through a certification process and have the ability to actually help you get live. We are local in your area. We are proven software solutions. All we've ever done is construction software, and you can see the number of products we represent here, and they're all softwares that are in the construction industry. And then we are a proven leader in implementation and training. So I told you that would be quick, and we'll get right into the webinar. As I mentioned, we have Mike Carbonneau with us today, and he is going to go over the TimberScan titanium product. Mike, I'm going to switch over to you right now. Make you presenter.
Perfect.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much, Jim, and welcome everyone. Appreciate your time. So yes, as Jim said today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about TimberScan titanium and how it works with Sage Intacct. I'll kick off my slideshow, and again, I only have a few slides as well, but just wanted to set this up by talking a little bit about TimberScan titanium in general, what we're going to be covering, and also a little bit about Core Associates and a little background with respect to who we are. So Core Associates was founded in 2008, and we developed a product called TimberScan. Some of you may be familiar with that product. It was developed specifically for Sage 300, and it was really the only product that was designed exclusively for Sage 300. What we do is we look at time-consuming manual processes, and we develop products and solutions to automate them. So we're trying to remove as many steps as possible, and we're also trying to eliminate the paper all along the way. And hopefully what you'll see today is another example of how you can process your payables from purchase to pay without having to touch the paper along the way. We have over 35,000 users worldwide, and our company consists of probably about 80 employees on 3 different continents. TimberScan Titanium, a complete purchase to pay solution where you never touch the paper, starting with acquiring invoices using an email monitoring or auto acquire, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Also being able to apply things like optical character recognition for AP invoices. There's also the ability to approve or process transactions in a mobile environment. So this is a cloud-based solution with a browser where you can simply go in. You can use this on any type of device to be able to process and approve, or just enter or process any information that you want. So the idea of our evolution of automation is designed around the idea of one system, one platform, and one data entry point that's integrated with Sage Intacct. So it has an automated workflow automation from acquire to routing and approval, designed exclusively for Sage Intacct. So we took the same concept that we designed for TimberScan for Sage 300 and did the exact same thing for Intacct. So this application was designed to work with the Intacct application, and I think as you see and we go through the product, you'll see different areas where we're picking up information directly from Intacct. So it becomes a very seamless integration. We also have the ability to create what are called electronic packets inside Sage Intacct. For example, you'll be able to see things that have been processed from within TimberScan Titanium. And this is the last slide that I'm going to show before we actually get into the product. Now, these four particular areas that you're seeing here, if you look at this at a very high level, it looks very somewhat simplistic. But there are a number of things that go into each of these various areas. And this is where I'm going to focus a lot of my attention. We're going to walk through a workflow process from purchase to pay, if you will. So we're going to start at the point where an invoice arrives at your door, and we'll talk about the different ways in which you go about acquiring those invoices. But once the invoices have been acquired, they're going to be sent to data entry. That data entry process will take place in TimberScan Titanium. What we've done is we've pulled the AP entry functionality from Sage Intacct back into TimberScan Titanium, and then we allow you to enter the invoices in Titanium as if you were keying them into Intacct. But what you'll see are some of the advantages that you can look into or process when you're processing an invoice. For example, using the optical character recognition tool. Once the invoices have been initially entered, they'll be sent off to the approvers. Again, the approvers are going to be able to approve the invoices in any type of environment that they want on any device. Once that approval process is done, that information gets updated into Sage Intacct. There's no quote unquote export import routine. Everything is done seamlessly. We pass the data directly to Sage Intacct and your financials are updated. When you process your payments, TimberScan Titanium has the ability to take the payment information, attach it to the invoice, so that ultimately what you're able to see, whether you're in Intacct or you're in TimberScan Titanium, would be the invoice, any of the supporting documents, and the check all together. So with that, again, I'm going to follow these steps, this workflow, when we go into the application, which I'm going to do now. And we will just kind of stay on that theme throughout this entire presentation. So let's go into the product now. Okay, so I've already logged into TimberScan Titanium, and I've also logged into Intacct. With Titanium, what you see here on the kind of on the main menu, as I've logged in, is I have a dashboard in front of me. So one of the things that you can do right out from the outset is that you can take a look at information that might be applicable to you, or if you were, for example, an executive and you wanted to look at things in more of kind of an executive dashboard view, you can see what is outstanding to other people as well. So what I've done initially, I've logged in, and let's say that I've logged in as an executive. I'm able to see everyone that has invoices that are associated with them. They may have been routed to them or what have you. So I'm able to see that we have 14 outstanding invoices, $68,000 in payables. None of them are on hold at this point, but they're all overdue. Now, as I start to work my way down into the various widgets here, you notice as I start hovering my mouse around the pie charts, it's telling me, for example, what vendor is associated with this and the dollar amount that's outstanding. Same thing with project, task. So I have different ways that I can go about searching and looking for this information, really at a very high level. So I'm looking at just the, kind of the basics here on the front end. Now, if I wanted to, I can get more specific. Maybe what I'd like to do is I can just scroll in here and say, let me look at a specific person, maybe one of our project managers, for example, and see how many outstanding invoices did they have. So now I just select that particular person. It brings up the outstanding invoices for that particular project manager. And again, I have the same criteria here. So I'm able to get specific and I can look at individuals, or if I'm an executive and I want to just look at this from the top level and see everything up on the outset, I can see it from here. Okay, so dashboard is one way, a quick, easy way for us to be able to see things, be able to keep, stay in front of everything, have access to where we are at any given time. But let's get into the application and let's go through that workflow process that I was referring to a couple of minutes ago. And I'm going to start at the point where an invoice arrives at your door. Now, regardless of how you receive the invoices, to get them into TimberScan Titanium, what you'll do is you'll select the acquire function, and then we'll go about acquiring some invoices. Now, there are several ways in which you can do this. One thing you can do is you could just drag and drop. So if I wanted to shrink this down, and maybe, I have something that got emailed to me, maybe it's in a folder, maybe it's sitting on my desktop, but I just want to take, I'm going to grab this 2-page PDF, and I'm just going to go ahead and drag and drop it into the system. And then I do have to fill in a couple of fields here, and I'll explain what they're for here in a moment. Go ahead and fill those in. We'll continue. And I've just opened up those two documents or invoices into the viewer. You have all of your annotation controls across the top. So if I want to just make this larger or smaller, I can. And as I'm looking, I also have my thumbnail open here so I can see both pages that I acquired. Page 1 shows me that this is invoice 393. In the thumbnail view, if I go to the second page, I notice that I have a second invoice. Now, normally what Titanium will do is it will treat each invoice or each PDF as a separate invoice. But in this case, because SCS sent me 2 invoices in one PDF, I need to separate these. So to do that, I can just right click as I just did, just click on split here, and I've just separated those 2 documents. It's that simple, that easy. Now, once I'm done with this, I can just go ahead and hit the acquire button, and it will acquire those invoices into the application, and they will be in my AP entry queue, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. So drag and drop is one option. A second option would be invoices that arrive in the mail. In that case, what you would do is put them onto your scanning device, and you'll scan them to a file that will link to Titanium. And then here, we simply come back in. We're just going to open up that particular scanned invoice file. I may have a whole stack of invoices. I may have, put 50 invoices on the scanner all at the same time, scan them in. I can just grab all of them together, open them up, and then they open up into the viewer the same way that we saw before. And then again, I'm able to size them and what have you. But as I go down through and look at each of the invoices, if everything is good, I hit the acquire button, and again, they're acquired into the system. Now, the other option is being able to acquire invoices automatically or what have you from an email. So built into the application is an email monitoring program. And it works in 2 different ways. So the first way that it can work is if you just want the email invoice, take the attachment from the email and drop it into a file, Titanium can do that behind the scenes for you. So without anyone having to monitor a specific, like say, AP email address and having to take each individual attachment and drag and drop it to this screen, the system's going to monitor that email address for you behind the scenes. It takes the attachment for you, drops it into a folder for you to be able to simply go out and acquire them automatically from here. So basically, I would just come in here. I would say, let me go out, open up that email file. Here are my emailed invoices that came in, and they've dropped into this folder for me automatically. I just go ahead and open them up. And again, same concept. I view them, I go ahead and acquire them. They get dropped into the AP entry queue. Very straightforward, very simple. What we do once that attachment has been pulled from the email, we archive that email so you know that it's been acquired and we brought it into the system. Now let's circle back one more time, and I want to talk about one other concept that you can deploy that's tied to email monitoring. Now what you've noticed, what I keep doing here is I go in here and I select my data entry group and I select what type of document I'm acquiring. So what we're doing is we're saying, okay, let's acquire these invoices and let's assign them to someone or some group of people in data entry. You can have multiple people, multiple groups, but you're basically just defining who is it that I'm sending these invoices to initially. They're going to pick them up in AP entry and they're going to start processing the invoices, which I'll talk about in a moment. But my first thing that I do is I identify who that is. Could be a person, could be a group. As I said, there could be multiple people or groups here. I just happen to have one. And then you define, we're acquiring invoices, and we'll talk about what happens if it's not an invoice, but it might be a check or some other type of document. So I do those two things before I go through the process of acquiring. Now, what TimberScan Titanium gives you is the ability to set up what is called auto acquire. So I was just referring to emailed invoices where they're going to come into an email address. They're going to be acquired automatically from the email into a folder, and then we're going to pull them out of the folder. We're going to define who we're going to assign them to, define the type of document, it being an invoice, and then we're just going to open up that folder and we're going to pull those invoices out of the folder. But what we're going to do in this case with auto acquires, we're going to make that step go away. We're not going to have to come into acquire. We're not going to have to go in and define who they're going to go to, what type of document it is, and pull them out of the file. We're going to let TimberScan Titanium do all of that work behind the scenes and drop those particular invoices right into my AP entry queue without any user intervention. So what auto acquire does is it says, okay, let's go out here, let's set this up. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, and you can do this for specific vendors that you're receiving invoices from, vendors or subs, I should say, or you can just do a wildcard and happens to come into this, sorry. Okay, let's make sure you can still see everything okay here. Okay, so what auto acquire is going to do is it's going to say either we're going to use this one specific vendor or sub that we're receiving invoices from, or I could set up a wildcard. They're coming into this AP email address. We're going to auto assign them to this particular person in AP entry. And if those invoices, if we had a scenario like we had with SCS, where we have more than one invoice in a particular batch, I'm going to use something like this where I'm going to say, if it shows that on the invoice it says invoice one of, I know that I have more than one invoice, so I want to split them. And then I'm going to apply the optical character recognition functionality to this. So ultimately what I'm doing is I'm saying it comes into the email address, it gets auto acquired, it gets auto assigned, it gets split if need be. And if there's OCR that we've set up for that particular vendor, it's going to apply the OCR components to it as well. No user intervention, everything's been acquired. I'm now ready to go into my AP entry process here and start processing my invoices. Completely eliminates that acquire step altogether. So here's step one of not having to touch the paper, but also to make it even more efficient, not even having to go out and execute this process. Let the system do it for you. Let's go to the next step. So this is the AP entry process. Now you're noticing here that there are two different queues sitting next to each other. One is the AP bill entry queue, the other is the purchasing entry queue. Actually, when you acquire an invoice, it actually drops into both of these queues at the same time. The difference between these is that there are certain fields that are associated with the purchasing entry queue that are not affiliated with an AP bill entry. And what I mean by that is if you're using the purchasing application, purchasing and receiving application from Sage Intacct, there are certain things that we want to be able to point to as we're acquiring an invoice so we can pull in that PO and receiver information and have that data available to me when I'm processing an invoice. Versus, let's just call it an overhead invoice, where I don't necessarily, I'm not going to apply this against a purchase order or receiver. And I might just want to eliminate some of those steps. So the AP bill entry queue just has less fields that you need to fill out so that you can speed through the process a little bit quicker. So I'm going to start with the purchasing entry queue. We're going to talk about processing invoices against purchase orders and receivers. I'm going to go in here and I'll start by just opening up an invoice. Let's take the very last invoice that happens to be in the queue. You notice how there are different ways that I can align this, but I've kind of set this up in a little bit of a format here where I have what almost looks like playing cards that are sitting here on the screen. And I can go in and start selecting all of these, and it will just start going through the queue one by one. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and just pull up this one invoice for right now. So as I do this, the first thing you're going to notice is that it opens up the invoice, but we're going to get a message that, well, I thought we were, that said that we don't have a capture template set up for this yet. And I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. But there are some specific fields here that relate, as I mentioned before, to the purchasing and receiving application within Sage Intacct. Now, even though I don't have a capture template set up, there are certain things that you can retrieve from an invoice, and I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. But let's go through and let's enter some information here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say what my entity is. We'll say that it's the Timberline General Construction entity. I will say that it is we'll call it a vendor invoice transaction. And then this converted from field really comes into play and becomes very handy for me. So if I've already created a purchase order, I can simply come out here. I can select that particular purchase order or subcontract. The system will then go through and it will pull up the rest of the information related to that particular purchase order and sub. And notice what it did down here at the bottom. It not only filled in the rest of my, what I refer to as the header information, but it also populated the distribution for me as well. So it took the information from the PO and or receiver, pulled that into here, and now I'm invoicing against that PO and receiver, and it will relieve that particular PO and receiver as we process the invoices. Now you can override if, for example, this is a quantity of one, but let's say that it was, or you can change the conversion type from quantity to each or something like that. So there are certain things that you can override here, but basically what you're seeing is that with very little information that I filled in, by just pulling up, for example, the transaction type that converted from, I'm able to pull in the rest of the information related to this invoice. At this point, what I could do potentially is I could just go ahead and save and route that invoice, and then TimberScan Titanium will send it off to the approvers. Now, how it gets to the approver is based on the business rules that you set up behind the scenes. One of the first things that you'll do when you're going through your setup of TimberScan Titanium is you'll go through this workflow setup process. You're defining the business rules, and then the system will take over and it will allow you to just route off to that particular person or people that you need to approve the invoice. You can have multiple people. You can have set up things like thresholds. Invoices greater than a certain dollar amount can be escalated up to another level of approval. All of that is possible. Now, let's circle back for just a second. Let's talk about some of the other mechanics that are associated with, with this particular data entry screen. So the first thing that you'll notice here is that all of these fields, these are aligned in the same order as they are in Sage Intacct. Every field is consecutive, one right after the other, exactly the same as if I were keying it into Sage Intacct. But what I can do is I can take advantage of some of the other tools that TimberScan Titanium allows me to do. For example, right here on the fly, if I want, I could set up an OCR template. Now it looks like there may already be one set up for this, so let's go through and reload this. And now what the system would do is it can allow me to go through and populate the rest of the information, or if I didn't have a template, I can start from scratch and I can go forward from there. Now, other things that I can do here on the screen, just to make this easier. If I wanted to, you notice how the invoice image is kind of blocked off by this data entry grid down here at the bottom. You can move this around. So if I wanted to say, let's just change this and move it over, I can shift this over to the other side. I can, take this where I can have the data entry grid on one side, the invoice image on the other. That's one option that I can choose. Another thing that I can do is I can just disconnect this invoice. So if I wanted to move this off to a second screen, I can do that. Now I have the invoice image on one screen. I have my data entry on the other, so I can see this in full view and see the data entry in full view. And then when I go through here, I can, go through and code, but if I want to just move this back, all I have to do is I just click on this little arrow and I move the invoice image back. Other things, attaching supporting documents. So TimberScan Titanium is not just an AP workflow application. It's a full document management system. So I could come in here, I could have acquired some other documents, maybe a purchase order, receiving ticket, packing slip. And I want to be able to just go ahead and pull them up if there happen to be any, based on certain criteria. Maybe, for example, what vendor, what project it's associated with. And I can just pull up those supporting documents. I can attach anything that I need and then save and route it off to whoever it needs to go to. You can add notes. So a number of different things that you can do. So let's back up for just a second. Let's look at a different scenario. Let's look at this invoice here. Okay, here's an invoice for Cook's Lumber. Now you'll notice that when I opened up this invoice, all of the information has already been pre-populated. Now, much of this could have potentially come from the OCR template. And I'm going to talk about the templates here in a second, but I'm just going to give you a little snippet where what I could do is I could say, let's say that I filled this in, I acquired this information, and from the transaction that I processed, maybe it filled in the vendor code. So I wrote out that purchase order in Sage Intacct. I acquired that purchase order information or subcontract information here. It brought up the vendor. What I can do is I can click on this little plus sign and it says, okay, add that particular field to Cook's Lumber's template. So what that means is that when I set up an OCR template, it's automatically just on the fly going to add the Cook's Lumber vendor code to the template. Let's go out and look at the templates for just a moment. And you can see I've already got one for Cook's Lumber. So let's just call it up. So what the system does when you acquire an invoice is it applies what's called smart extraction technology. It starts looking at certain key information from a vendor's invoice, and it acquires that for you automatically. So it's already reading the invoice number, the date. It's probably found the dollar amount down here. This information will pre-populate on the invoice even without a template set up. But when I go to the next screen, what I can also do is I can start adding my profiles. So when I just clicked on that plus sign, what it did was it said, okay, apply vendor number 100. Well, say one electric because that's the example that I used. But it applied that vendor code directly to the Cook's Lumber template, so that from this point forward, anytime I receive an invoice from Cook's Lumber, it's going to know that it's going to recognize this vendor code. And I could do the same thing with project and any other number of information. So for example, if I go back here, and I apologize, we're going to bounce back and forth here for just a second. So let's go look at this invoice. Here's an invoice where I have the template set up for A1 Electric. Not only did I say I wanted to retrieve the invoice number, billing date, due date, dollar amount, but I also, because A1 Electric puts their PO number or subcontract number on their invoices, I was able to reference this. So it found sub 00165 and it pulled that information directly from that particular invoice. So basically when I acquired this invoice, it came in, it read the information, it was able to reference all of this information from what was created in Sage Intacct, and it applies all of this information accordingly. Jump back to the template for a second. Let's look at A1 Electric. So here it is. Again, I came in here, I said, okay, take this, make this subcontract number be my my PO number, whatever it is. Make sure that we capture their vendor number and any other information that I wanted to acquire. So basically, the system gives you kind of a head start, but then you can start to add some other fields to that particular template. So let's go one more time. and I'm going to look at my capture templates. I'm going to go out and acquire an invoice real quick. We won't spend very much time on this. We want to jump to the rest of the functionality here. But let's go out, let's acquire an invoice. And I don't think I have one in here for George. So let's go do that. Okay, and we'll just say acquire it. Once it's acquired, it's going to drop into my queues here. Okay, so if I were to go out, and let's say that I wanted to add a new template. I'm going to call it George. And we will save that. We're going to go out and acquire it. Okay. So from here, system will go out, it will read information off of the template. See how it automatically applied the smart technology. It put in the invoice number, the billing date, the due date. And then if I wanted to, I could retrieve other information. You know, maybe this is where the job site is, and I want to use this as my project number or what have you. And then I can also go in and I can apply other information such as the vendor number. But for right now, let's just go through and without adding any other fields, let's just say that we want to go ahead and save this. So we'll save it. Let's see, it should have done that already. Oops, all right, so we'll go through, we'll add one thing here. We'll just say description for right now, just to have that in there. Okay, probably no need to fill out anything else. Save it. Good. All right, so we're finished. I'm done. I'm going to go back into invoice entry. We're going to look at that very last invoice. It's the George Wireless invoice. It hasn't matched the template. So what happened was I acquired the invoice before I actually set up my OCR template. But what I can do here, you notice that it has applied the smart extraction where it put in, for example, the invoice number, you know, the date, the amount, what have you. Now I can come in here and I can say, okay, right from here, I don't even know if I have a George Wireless, but we'll find something. Let's just use George's excavation as our example. And now when I go through and process this, I can save this information and then I can just automatically apply that vendor code to this particular invoice. And from this point forward, it will take every George Wireless invoice and it will apply the vendor code, project number, anything else that I want right from this screen. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say reload OCR. And there it is. So now I can come in here, plug this in, add the plus sign, and now it's added that particular field. That's how quickly, so I've set up a template. I set up the template literally. It took me longer to explain how to set up the template than it actually did to set the template up. I probably could do this template in 10 seconds. I'm out here, I've already acquired their invoice. Said, okay, let's go through and add that particular vendor code and I'm done. Okay, so let's do this. We've gone through the AP entry process. We've taken invoices that have gone through the purchasing queue, AP bill entry queue. The only difference here is that the information, there's a little less information to fill out. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here with this, but you can see that there are just less fields for me to go through on this screen. So for overhead invoices and those types of things, it might be easier to just use this rather than you know, the other screen that we just saw before. Let's say that we've gone ahead, we've saved and routed these invoices. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the approver side. I did want to mention that there is a notification system that's designed inside Intacct, or excuse me, inside Titanium. So I can come in here and I can send off notifications to folks, and you can set up alerts as well. So I can notify someone if I want, when I want to, when I want to send off a notification to them, how often I want to do this. And if I want to send them an alert and say, if you have invoices that are within 5 days of the discount date, 3 days of the due date, those types of things, I can send them an alert. So let's say we've done that. Now I'm going to change and I'm going to become an approver. So an approver also has the ability to log in. I can do this on my desktop, or let's just say, for example, that I happen to be, working, from my phone or what have you. I'll make this even smaller. So it shrinks this down, and we'll say that I'm on my phone. I have my invoices that got routed to me. What I can do here is I can scroll up and down. There are some basic information that you can see just by scrolling up and down from the invoice itself to get some summary information. But then you have this reject and sync task button. Now, what these mean is that perhaps this invoice came to me, and maybe it's not an invoice that's associated with my project. I can go ahead and reject the invoice right from here if I want. Rather than having to get into the details, I can just reject it, send it back to where it needs to go. If you reject an invoice, you have to specify a reason why you're rejecting it. And also, if there are multiple people in a workflow, it can reject back to previous approvers. What syncing the task does is it's saying, okay, this is not a fully coded invoice. And that's something I should have mentioned when we were talking about the invoice entry, that one of the key attributes of the way TimberScan Titanium works is you don't have to fully code an invoice in order to send it off to an approver. You can just send off a partially coded invoice and then let the approver do the rest of the work on their end. Now here, if this invoice had been fully coded, there would be an approval button here that I could also execute, meaning I don't need to dig into the details, I can approve it. Now let me also mention that both of these buttons, if you don't want your approvers to simply come in here and go approve, 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 or what have you, you can lock these down so that they can't do that. If I need to actually go in and execute something on the invoice, I just click sync the task. It opens up the invoice, and then it gives me the opportunity to look at certain information. This invoice, let's go back out here and look at one that has more detail. This one here is probably one that has lots of entries. It does. Okay. So here's an invoice that came in, and you notice how I've kind of switched up my display here. So instead of looking at this in the grid view, which is nice for being on the desktop, what I did is I switched to what's called the form view. The reason why I did that is because if I were working on a phone, it's probably not going to be very easy for me from a phone to be able to review and maybe see the line item information of this invoice. So instead, what I can do is I can do this in the form view, and then I can just go through the various transaction items. And if I need to fill in anything, for example, I need to put in my cost type or whatever it is that I need to fill in, I can go ahead and do that, and then I can proceed forward from there. So that it's an option depending on what type of device you're working on. But typically, if you're working on a phone, you're probably going to want the form view where you have the invoice image in kind of one view here, and you have the data on the other side so that you can see both, and you can just go through and you can process from there. Now, other things that I can do as an approver, I can put an invoice on hold. I mentioned rejecting the invoice. If you do either of those two things, hold or reject, you have to put a reason in as to why you're doing that. That way, if anyone else wants to know the status, they can see it. If I made some changes, but I'm not ready to go through and execute anything else, I can just save those changes. You can email directly from here. So if maybe I'm in correspondence with someone, at the, Beaverton Sand and Gravel, and maybe I want to go ahead and send them off an email, and I also want to attach the invoice to go along with it. You can do everything from one step here. This prevents you from having to, let's say, download this invoice, create a PDF, go out to your email, Outlook, for example, and attach that PDF to the Outlook email. All of these things are possible. You can perhaps reroute an invoice if you need to. You can attach supporting documents as an approver. And then, of course, you can go ahead and approve the invoice. And approving means it's approved, and then if there's anyone else in the workflow, it would get sent off to them. If you happen to be the final approver or final reviewer of the invoice, once you approve, that invoice updates updates Sage Intacct automatically. All of your data has been updated, and you proceed forward from there. Okay, so let's say that we've gone through and we've actually processed and we've approved invoices. What we can see inside of Sage Intacct is this. Here's an invoice that I called up. I'm going to open up the attachments. And from here, here's that invoice that got attached to that particular transaction. So we sent this over to Intacct. Not only did we send over the data, we sent over the transaction as well. Now let's say that we processed a payment against this particular invoice. Back in Titanium, what you can do is you could go through, depending on how you process that payment, whether you did a paper check, you did ACH, whatever it might be, you can take that transaction and you can attach it to the invoice. There's an attached check feature, which for paper checks, you would come in here, you would acquire those paper checks, you would go through the attached check process, and it's basically just rippling through a whole batch of checks all at one time, attaching them to the invoices, because again, it's reading the data from Sage Intacct, so it knows that this check paid specific invoices from within Intacct. And then once you've gone through and attached, if you go back over to Sage Intacct, you can then see not only the invoice, but you can also see the check. So now you have a full packet of information that's available to you from within Intacct. And then the final thing that I wanted to show is, in addition to any of the other supporting documents, et cetera, if you needed to do any type of a roll-up, maybe you're working with a time and material or cost plus project, or maybe it's for a loan draw or some other type of scenario where you need to be able to provide the backup to be able to support a substantiated billing, you would do that through what's called the search criteria here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and I'll say, let's go ahead and grab something for a particular project. And we will use this here. I will search, I'll go out, I'll find my invoices and any other supporting documents that may have been associated with it. And when you click on this invoice report, what it does is it actually builds a report on the fly where you could put a title and subtitle if you need to on it. And then behind the report are all of those invoices and any supporting documents that may have been affiliated with that particular invoice. So what we've done is we've completed the process of acquiring, processing invoices. We applied OCR if we needed to. We sent these invoices off for approval. We sent the approved invoices to Intacct to be updated. We were able to process payments and then attach the payment record to the invoice. And then ultimately, if we needed to have any type of backup, any roll-up, any substantiated billing type of data, we have all of that available to us as well. And again, one last comment that I'll make, I won't go into this in detail, but everything that you saw me do from a workflow perspective for AP invoices, you can do the exact same thing for any other type of document. So if you have a workflow where, for example, for certain documents, contracts, what have you, they need to be routed to certain people for approval, you can acquire any type of document, put it in the system, set up a workflow, and do the exact same process that we just saw. And with that, Jim, I'm going to turn it back to you